Good evening and welcome to Novara Live. My name's Stephen Methven, and tonight I'm joined by Helena, aka NoJusticeMTG. Helena, we're both pulling the double shifts this week. How are you finding it?
I mean, it's always a pleasure to spend my time with you, Stephen. I'm looking forward to the show as always.
As am I, and I think it's a good show tonight, actually. Coming up tonight, Canada has joined international calls to recognise Palestinian statehood, and Donald Trump isn't happy. Nurses in the UK plan to strike if their pay demands aren't met, and a new metric reveals that Keir Starmer is even less popular than we thought, if you can imagine it. Now, if you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. Israel's government claims to have allowed greater access of humanitarian aid into Gaza over the last few days. They say they have instituted tactical pauses in military operations in 3 areas and created what they've called designated humanitarian corridors. But aid workers say those new measures have done nothing to stop the starvation crisis spreading across Gaza as we speak. And while a small number of aid trucks administered by the UN are now entering the Strip, the distribution of food is inadequate, rushed, chaotic, and deeply dangerous for aid workers and Palestinians alike. The United Nations Department dealing with humanitarian emergencies, OCHA, has released this footage, shot yesterday near the Kerem Shalom border crossing in southern Gaza.
Stay away. It's kids. It's children. Stay there.
لا don't do this لا
Check your doors locked, manual lock as well, safety lock as well. Foxtrot confirm
received, moving.
Today we went on a mission to pick up food supplies from Kerem Shalom. One of the constraints that we faced was waiting about 2.5 hours at an Israeli forces checkpoint, which by the time we were allowed to pass, we were met on the road by tens of thousands of hungry and desperate people who directly offloaded everything from the backs of our trucks. Another constraint that we're facing is the very limited time to load the cargo. And so we are unable to secure it properly with belts or tarps, which makes it very easily fall off from the backs of the trucks, as the roads are quite rough and sometimes we have to drive at quite high speeds.
Oh my God.
So these constraints have to be addressed. Access must be expanded. Much more food needs to be entering on a regular basis so that communities have the confidence that supplies are coming and that they will be receiving them and that they will be distributed properly.
Some incredibly shocking scenes there. And for those of you listening on the podcast, what we saw were hundreds, if not thousands, of starving Palestinians, including children, under gunfire, identified by OCHA as coming from Israeli troops. The famished people then surged around the convoy in search of food as the shooting continued. Now, at least one was injured and received medical aid with help from the UN. And that video, I think, also gives a real sense of the scale of devastation in Gaza, with smashed roads strewn with truck parts and rubble. There was also a further mass shooting at the Zikim crossing in northern Gaza. On Wednesday, crowds had gathered at the crossing to obtain limited flour supplies, which were being transported across the border from Israel. At least 69 people were killed by Israeli forces as they headed towards aid trucks. Over 400 casualties were taken to the Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza City, many of them carried there on carts. Now, the Wall Street Journal has published a very compelling graphic that shows exactly how dire the food situation in Gaza is right now. To the left of the image is all the aid delivered to Gaza between July last year and March this year, with food aid in purple and other aid such as medicines, materials, and so forth in orange. Under the UN coordinated system, there was at times a good flow of aid into the Strip, though it was still often below the bare minimum of 62,000 tons of food staples needed each month. Then there was the total blockade, that's the bit in grey, from March to May, when absolutely nothing got through. And since then, only 2/3 of the required aid got through in June and much less in May and July. And remember, food goes off, it gets wet or otherwise ruined when people are constantly on the move, and the effects of starvation are not instantaneous, they're cumulative. There are currently no safe ways to receive aid in Gaza. There have been multiple shootings by Israeli soldiers at Israel-controlled Gaza Humanitarian Foundation sites, and now multiple shootings by troops at the tiny numbers of UN convoys crossing at just 2 border posts. Well over 1,000 Palestinians have now been shot dead by Israeli troops while desperate for aid. Countries including Egypt, Jordan, the United Arab Emirates and Spain have dropped aid into Gaza from planes. It's never very much at all, a few tons per flight at best, but it does make for flashy humanitarian marketing. It's also dangerous, leading to scrambles on the ground. And last March, 5 Palestinian children were reported killed when 2 parachutes failed to open. What airdrops could potentially have provided, however, is a way for journalists to have a closer look at what Israel is doing in Gaza. That's what the BBC's Jeremy Bowen hoped when he boarded a Jordanian flight. Then this happened.
So the Jordanians have passed on a message from the Israelis. The Israelis don't want us to film out of the window at the devastation inside Gaza. But I've spent 10 minutes looking at it with my own eyes. And I can tell you that communities in the north of Gaza that I knew well, very vibrant, tens of thousands of people living hard lives, but actually with a remarkable human spirit, are flat. There's nothing left of them. Now, if you've been watching satellite pictures, it won't come as any surprise. But seeing it is really something. Israel will not allow reporters like myself to enter Gaza to report the story. And they don't want us to see it, to film it anyway, from above either.
They don't even want us to film it from above. Now, I saw some people speculating that that might be because it would give away IDF positions to Hamas or other fighters in the Strip. I mean, it might. But what it's much more likely to do from that height is indicate the vast extent of the damage that Israel has done to Gaza, the vast destruction that has swept from the north to the south and the east, and from the east to the west of that small enclave. Someone who's been a witness to that destruction is my guest that I spoke to earlier today. Her name is Amira. She's a 20-year-old medical student in Gaza. And though she hasn't been able to continue her studies for nearly 2 years now, she is volunteering for Reviving Gaza, a mutual aid initiative providing the immediate and basic needs of people in Gaza. A hungry and to my eye, quite tired Ola joined me from Gaza City. And I began by asking her how difficult it is to get food in Gaza and how people were coping with their hunger.
The situation in Gaza is undescribable right now. Even if I spent hours here talking about what is really going in Gaza, is not going to give it the full credit of it. However, I'm trying to do my best in delivering what is really going on. So in the market, food does not exist because of the recent blockades and the borders are closed. Food is scarce, and even if you were able to find food, its price is crazy. It's skyrocketed every moment, and people who have gone into a deliberate starvation and have gone into this 2020 month of starvation have lost their income, and people can't afford to buy food at this crazy prices. So many people are now collapsing on the street right now. People are literally dying from hunger. And according to Ministry of Health, this recent week, 79 people have died because of hunger. Could you imagine that? That means almost more than 10 people are dying daily because of starvation. And this is actually what we try to do in Reviving Gaza Group. We try to provide food and water to people so they can have a chance to survive. And we target people who not only they don't live in camps, we don't even, their life are miserable. They don't live in camps, they're literally living in the streets. And they have lost everything during this devastating war. So we try to buy the food from people who have previous storage before the war, or they got it from, the different tribes, if you heard about it, Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. People risk their lives to get there, to get some kind of food to silence their children aching stomachs. And we try to reach these people and buy what we can from them, and we try to buy a huge amount so we get it in a better deal and better price. And this food, we try to distribute them to people who are in the most desperate conditions, to orphans, to mothers, to people with autism, the elderly, and everyone who is in need.
So what you were describing there in terms of distribution of aid, is that the Revival Gaza Mutual Aid Project that you're talking about?
Yeah, Reviving Gaza Mutual Aid Project. It's
Reviving Gaza, okay.
Reviving Gaza. It's a great mutual aid network. It's Palestinian-led. It's volunteer-led. It has started since the beginning of the war. We try to provide people, our aim from its name, to revive the hope in people and help people as much as we can to have them a chance, let them have a chance to have a future, to live.
We will be putting the link to that project in the show when this interview airs, so people out there will be able to support it from here. Ola, let me talk about your life in Gaza. You are a medical student. Can you tell me what the last 20 months has meant for you, how it's changed your life?
It's beyond description. To be honest, there's no electricity, there's no classes, no reliable internet. So instead of studying like any medical student, busy of studying, studying here has become nearly impossible. Okay, but I choose to study medicine just because I love to help people. I love to relieve the pain of people. So this is the same reason that led me to join Reviving Gaza. Because at least I can't now, because of the ongoing situation, I can't complete my education, but at least now I can help people prevent dying of people from starvation. You know what I mean? I can't help people die in operation rooms with a scalpel, but now I can help people not die because of the starvation with Reviving Gaza group. So studying now has become like a dream for us. Continuing education has become like a dream for us, for all medical students here, for all people with ambitions and dream in Gaza. Our future is unknown, and we literally don't know what the future is going to be for us.
Israel has said that it's slowly allowing aid in, outside of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, that it's allowing the UN, for example, to deliver a small amount of aid. There's also been airdrops from various countries. Are these making any difference at all to the situation?
The starvation is still going on. People are still dying until now. Until I'm speaking to you, people are dying from starvation. And I can't deny, I'm talking to you right now, and I personally didn't have neither my lunch or breakfast, because people here in Gaza, there is no food, you know what I mean? It's just only in media. But the situation in Gaza has not changed since the borders has closed. People can't afford to buy food. Food does not even exist in the market, and even if you find it, its price is crazy and people can't afford it.
And what do you and other Palestinians in Gaza feel about the international response to the situation? Do you feel like the international community is putting enough pressure on Israel? What would you like? What would you like the world to be doing to help you?
Well, actually, the situation and the world response to what is really going here is super disappointing. It makes us, feel in despair, because How could this in 2025, how could this happens in front of many people's eyes and people are not taking the action that should have been taken? The genocide should stop right now. People are dying every moment and people are not taking the serious actions. It's just words. There's no real pressure. There's no accountability for what is really going here in Gaza. I always say that, in the West, we always, they even have animals' rights. But here in Gaza, we are treated less than animals, and nobody is talking about it. Even though we're talking about it, but there's no actions. There's not genocide is still going on, and people are dying. If they're not dying because of hunger, of bombing, they're dying because of starvation. If they're not dying because of starvation, because they are dying because of diseases. You know what I mean? There is many cases of people who have died suddenly without pumping or being killed, because they are dying because of the lack of medications and proper care. So no, people are not taking there's no right actions. We need a pressure to invest. What is going in Gaza needs to stop. Okay, the borders needs to open. Genocide should stop. People are dying, and countries needs to take action about it, because we always say through the history, when all this disasters happened, they always like how in the future we would never let this happen, but this is literally happening in front of your eyes, and people are not taking the proper action of stopping it. We are humans. We have dreams and we have ambitions, and we never wanted our ambitions to be about a piece of bread. Okay, now if you give someone a Palestinian in Gaza a piece of bread, he would thank you, and it's like giving him the whole world. But should not be our dream. Should be our rights. You know what I mean? We want to continue to pursue our dreams and ambitions. We want to see our house rebuilt. We want the genocide to stop and the borders to be opened, and see our lovely city alive again and back to normal, and have our rights fulfilled without, the recent genocide and the starvation.
I can't imagine having been that eloquent and composed when I was 20 at any time, let alone in the middle of a genocide, a famine. Very, very impressive young person there, Amira, 20-year-old medical student. Now, as I said in that interview, we've put a link to the Reviving Gaza fundraiser in the description if it's something that you would like to support. I spoke to Ola for a bit longer than what we showed you there. We'll be putting out the full interview at 9 p.m. this evening, so do come back and have a look at that. There's a new trend sweeping the halls of power in Western states across the world. At the moment when things are most bleak for Palestinians, Western leaders are toying with the idea of recognizing a Palestinian state. But in a speech in Geneva on Wednesday night, Amir Ohana, the Speaker of Israel's parliament, the Knesset, let the world know what his country thought of those plans.
If you wish what you call a Palestinian state, put it up in London, in Paris, in your countries, which become more and more similar to the Middle East. The so-called peace that some European countries advocate for will only result in more war.
No, we won't put it up in our countries. We'll put it up in the country of the Palestinians. That's their country, their state, exactly where it is. Also, a fair amount of casual racism about European capitals in that statement. I feel like that's only to be expected at this point. In response to Ohana's speech, Arab, Iranian and European delegates walked out. The representatives were seen exiting the hall directly under the podium as Ohana spoke. Ohana's statement chimes with those of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel's ambassador to the UN, Danny Damon. They both labelled Palestinian statehood recognition a reward for the crimes of October the 7th, as though Palestinians are Hamas, as though Palestinians are responsible for the things that Hamas did on October the 7th, as though Palestinians should be either rewarded or punished for the acts of a group which is something, which most of them are not involved with. Although that is not what Israel would like you to believe. Israel would like you to believe that every single Palestinian in Gaza is Hamas and therefore equally culpable for the war crimes committed on October 7th. The fashion for recognizing Palestinian statehood was kicked off last week by France when President Emmanuel Macron said the country would recognize Palestine in September. That was followed by the UK following suit, kind of, when Keir Starmer announced we would recognize Palestine in September unless Israel agrees to a ceasefire and a long-term peace process. So let's just gloss over the idea of Palestinian self-determination being used as a weapon against Israel. And also, let's just gloss over the notion that that self-determination doesn't exist until Britain says it does. Starmer's plan, however, has already hit some obstacles. 40 peers, including some of the country's top lawyers, according to The Times, have written to the Prime Minister saying that recognizing a Palestinian state could break the law. The Montevideo Convention holds that a state needs a defined territory, a permanent population, an effective government, and the ability to have relationships with other states. The Times reports this on the Lord's letter. The letter added that there is no certainty over the borders of a proposed Palestinian state, while the government would face difficulty continuing to recognize millions of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza as refugees, given recognition of statehood would mean they were in their own territory. They also argued that there is no functioning single government and it has no capacity to enter into diplomatic relations. Hamas is a proscribed terror group in the UK. So the lawyers there taking the conditions in the Montevideo Convention and saying, a state of Palestine doesn't satisfy any of these. But listen, if these are the best lawyers the UK has, we're in deep trouble because we, the UK, aren't even signed up to the Montevideo Convention. Its signatories are all in the Americas. And it won't surprise you, some of the signatories, such as Lord David Pannick, have links to UK lawyers for Israel. It is desperate, truly desperate, and pretty embarrassing. I mean, it's not as though recognizing the Palestinian state is actually going to change anything really in respect of the situation in Palestine, except that it recognizes that Palestinians have a right to self-determination. But for some, that is already too much. Recognizing the peoplehood of the Palestinians, recognizing their right to form a government, to create a state, to self-defense, that is far too much for those on the side of Israel. On BBC's The World at One, Trade Secretary Jonathan Reynolds responded to the letter.
I think, to be honest, with respect to those colleagues, that is missing the point somewhat. What we want to see is not just a ceasefire to the conflict in Gaza, but a genuine peace process, a long-term settlement, and that requires a two-state solution. And we're trying to use the recognition of a Palestinian state, which many countries around the world have already done so, I think 140. But we're trying to do that in a way which genuinely moves forward this peace process, deals with short-term issues like getting sufficient aid into Gaza, which is a huge deal, but also sets in place a serious long-term peace process. And that is the objective. I think that is the right objective, and that is what we're seeking to do. And I would ask colleagues to appreciate that and look at the levers the UK has to help deliver something which millions of people around the world are desperate to see.
It's such a stupid proposal. Let's say Israel doesn't agree to that peace process, and then you recognize a Palestinian state. What do you think that's going to, what is that going to do? How is that going to change anything? What you should be doing is applying maximal economic pressure to Israel until it withdraws from Gaza, and then talk about recognition of the Palestinian state and imposing a peace process on Israel, not inviting it to participate in one, imposing internationally as an international community a peace process on Israel, which gives rise to a decent, humane, and long-lasting, sustainable settlement for the Palestinians in whatever form that takes. Now, Canada has now joined the fray to recognize a Palestinian state. This was Prime Minister Mark Carney speaking at a press conference on Wednesday night.
For the reasons I cited earlier, Canada intends to recognize the state of Palestine at the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly in September 2025. This intention is predicated on the Palestinian Authority's commitment to much-needed reforms, including commitments by the Palestinian Authority's President Abbas to fundamentally reform its governance, to hold general elections in 2026 in which Hamas can play no part, and to demilitarize the Palestinian state. Canada will increase its efforts in supporting strong democratic governance in Palestine and the contributions of its people to a more peaceful and hopeful future. I spoke today with President Abbas at length to reaffirm his commitments. Canada reiterates that Hamas must immediately release all hostages taken in the horrific terrorist attack of October 7th, that Hamas must disarm, and that Hamas must play no role in the future governance of Palestine.
Now, one person not joining the global trend is US President Donald Trump. He hit back at Mark Carney on Truth Social saying this: "Wow, Canada has just announced that it's backing statehood for Palestine. That will make it very hard for us to make a trade deal with them. Oh, Canada." Those neighbors are currently in discussion seeking to prevent Trump from imposing a 35% tariff on all Canadian imports. They're due to end on Friday, the 1st of August. So Trump very willing to impose punitive tariffs on Canada, but not on Israel, the state actually committing a genocide rather. And in response to Carney's speech, Israeli ambassador to Canada, Ido Moed, said this: "We will not sacrifice our very existence by permitting the imposition of a jihadist state on our ancestral homeland that seeks our annihilation." Helena, the crazy thing about all of this is it's really based on the idea of a two-state solution, right? There's this pretense. I mean, the idea of a two-state solution is in many senses a pretense, especially when you have, I don't know, 750,000 Israeli settlers living in the occupied territories in the West Bank, happily building towns, cinemas, complexes, malls on land which is supposed to be Palestinian land. So that sort of makes, absolutely zero, a mockery of the idea of a two-state solution. I mean, Israel's got absolutely no intention of removing those 750,000 settlers from those lands back into, as it were, Israel proper. But also the way that Palestinian statehood is being presented here is as, I think I said on an earlier show, this kind of like bizarre, perverse European logic that, in order to get a state in this region, you have to have survived a genocide. Starmer's even worse, sort of saying, well, the only good use of the notion of a Palestinian state is to use it to sort of threaten Israel into submission, which obviously they're never going to do. I mean, is it performative or is it just me? Am I just incredibly cynical?
There's a lot of performativity towards it. I think that internal pressure from the citizens of countries in the West, in a lot of cases, I think that's definitely true of places like France, Canada, and definitely in the United Kingdom, where opinion on Israel's occupation of Palestine has soured since people became more learned of the fact. A lot of people just didn't understand the reality of the situation because it wasn't as politically important in those times, at least not in terms of what those states were talking about. People's knowledge was very, very low. They had ignorance of the realities of the Nakba, because for a lot of time in the West, people only understood the Nakba as the Arab armies telling people to leave, and Israel just happened to occupy those houses, rather than an explicit ethnic cleansing campaign, as we know from the new historians and declassified documents, for example. So people's understanding of the Israel-Palestine conflict really is shaped by their ignorance in the West. But as they've learnt more since the start of this conflict, there's been more acquiescence and more demands internally from these states to want to recognize Palestine. While there's that Israeli official there saying, well, Europe's become more like the Middle East, essentially trying to imply that the only reason that countries in the West are starting to want to recognize Palestine is because they've had too many immigrants, essentially. Israel continually trying to paint itself as the bulwark against the uncivilized East from the civilized West, for example. That's what Isaac Herzog said in an interview with Laura Kuenssberg so long ago, making these accusations that, well, you'll recognize your enemies eventually if you let them in. It's very kind of a really, really kind of far-right thing for him to imply there. But regardless, obviously, I think there is a performativity. What I wanted to touch on the reality of the Montevideo Convention, which is that this isn't legally enforceable under international law. Them trying to say that it would be a violation that we would therefore be that would discredit us is just completely untrue. First of all, I think there's a lot of dispute over whether Palestine even wouldn't be subject to those rules. For example, you look at the governance, you've got the Palestinian Authority, the population at time of recording is at least somewhat stable in terms of the areas they inhabit, not trying to expand. They're only being contracted by the colonial desires of Israel. And when it comes to the borders, well, the borders are only at this point disputed because of Israel. Israel considers its borders to not be defined. There is nowhere in, for example, the founding Israeli constitution that defines its own borders. So if we're going to take recognition of a state under the Montevideo Convention as being somehow a hard and fast rule rather than a set of guidelines, we shouldn't recognize the state of Israel either, because it doesn't have clearly defined borders because of its nature as a colonial state trying to occupy as much of Palestine as possible. The issue comes, of course, when we do recognize Palestine as a state. If we did, and we would have to define what borders we do recognize, you'd expect it to be 1967 rather than Area A, which I think a lot of states might do to avoid clashing with Israel. Because if you do recognize the 67 borders, then you would have to be far more kind of fastidious in terms of trying to force Israel out of Area C, to try and force the settlements out of Palestinian territory, because now you recognize it. These aren't just kind of tacit violations of international law, building in disputed territory. This is explicit land grabs against a state that you have recognized. And that gets the government to a lot more legal complications than they otherwise would. So there's a lot of caveats here as to what this might look like, but unless they do recognize the 67 borders, it really is only going to do kind of small amounts to change the situation. But explicit recognition of the 67 borders, that really would, I think, force a lot of Western governments into the position of having to force Israel to not engage as much colonialism as it currently is into the West Bank, especially.
Well, that's probably a good reason for them not to do it, right? I mean, that's a good reason to suppose that this is just some posturing. I know France has said they'll do it in September. Well, let's see. Carney attached conditions to his recognition. Starmer has attached conditions to his. Let's see how this unfolds. Nurses in England, Wales, and the north of Ireland have indicated that a strike might be on the cards this winter. That's after 9 out of 10 nurses balloted by the Royal College of Nurses rejected the government's current pay offer of a 3.6% rise. More than 170,000 nurses took part in the ballot, with 91% of them saying no to Health Secretary Wes Streeting's pay offer. RCN General Secretary Nicola Ranger said this: "My profession feels deeply undervalued, and that is why record numbers are telling the government to wake up, sense the urgency here, and do what's right by them and by patients. Record numbers have delivered this verdict on a broken system that holds back nursing pay and careers and hampers the NHS. We deliver the vast majority of care in every NHS service and deserve to be valued for all our skill, knowledge, and experience. To avoid formal escalation, the government must be true to its word and negotiate on reforms of the outdated pay structure, which traps nursing staff at the same band their entire career." Responding to the ballot, a spokesperson for the Department of Health said this: "After receiving 2 above-inflation pay rises from this government, new full-time nurses will earn £30,000 in basic pay for the first time this year, so it's disappointing that RCN members are dissatisfied with this year's pay rise. We hugely value the work of nurses, and through our 10-year health plan, we are rebuilding the NHS for the benefit of patients and staff and ensuring nursing remains an attractive career choice. The government is clear we can't move any further on headline pay, but we'll work with the RCN to improve their major concerns, including pay structure reform, concerns on career progression, and wider working conditions." The nurses aren't the only NHS workers battling for better pay. GPs have also threatened Wes Streeting with a winter strike after setting out 6 demands they want met by the autumn. They're concerned by what part they will play in the government's 10-year NHS plan that was mentioned by the RCN General Secretary there, which aims to change the NHS by making 3 shifts, moving from hospital to community, from analog to digital, and from sickness to prevention. And it's the third and the first shifts that are most likely to impact GPs: hospital to community and treatment to prevention. And these GPs want government assurances that GP practices will lead what are being called new neighbourhood hubs. Those are supposed to bring tests, post-operative care, nursing and mental health teams much closer to people's homes. GPs are also demanding a timeline for investment and the renewal of GP contracts. And all of this comes off the back of a 5-day-long junior doctors' strike that ended on Wednesday. Speaking to BBC Breakfast, Emma Runswick from the British Medical Association was asked whether there would be further junior doctor strikes.
That's a political choice that him and his government have to make. Are they prepared to continue to have strike action in the NHS? Are they prepared to continue losing doctors abroad? Or do they want to give us the £4 more an hour that will take doctors to earning about £22 an hour from first qualified and keep doctors in the country, given the care that patients deserve, getting back on top of the waiting lists and fixing the NHS?
Is this all about money? I mean, we know the figures, don't we? A 28.9% pay rise over the last 3 years. To a lot of people, that sounds like a lot of money.
It only sounds like a lot of money because that's how much we've lost. In reality, that's 8% over inflation, and it's only a partial reversal of the pay cuts that we've had since 2008. So we are looking for £4 additional for newly qualified doctors. And we've just brought in discussions about training numbers, i.e. jobs, for doctors to make sure that we can retain them in the health service so that we can give patients the best care.
It's interesting that percentage top-line figure in terms of pay rises and pay asks by the junior doctors. You know, that was a sort of, I remember in the last doctor strike, them taking actually doing a really good job of explaining how that percentage came about. It sounds so big because so much was cut in a way, or we've missed out on so many pay rises, hence it sounds so big, but it's not as big as you think it is. But I think this strategy of just talking about £4 an hour is, going to be much more successful. And that's why you'll see, for example, West Streeting and the media clinging to the percentage term, because the percentage term decontextualized from the pay degradation that it's supposed to make up for sounds enormous. But when you talk about £4, a much clearer picture for the public, I think. But writing in The Guardian yesterday, Streeting was combative. His message to the doctors: work with the government, because if they go to war with Labour, they'll lose. Well, you know, maybe workers just shouldn't have to go to war with Labour, Wes. Maybe that's what Labour is for. In the article, he also resorts to some classic divide and conquer tactics, saying this about NHS nurses and their pay deal. None of them, the NHS nurses, have had a pay rise of 28.9%. Only resident doctors can claim to have received the highest pay rise in the public sector 2 years in a row. No wonder other NHS staff have looked on aghast at the action of the BMA. The BMA's demands and the speed with which it launched a strike, and a 5-day strike at that, have left many other NHS staff, most of them paid far less than doctors, dismayed and appalled. Helena, that's a very distinct change in tone from the tone that Streeting Streeting had when he came into office last year, where it was much more conciliatory and sort of working with medical staff, et cetera. Now it's, you know, if you fight with us, we're going to beat you. What do you think about what's likely to happen in the future in terms of NHS strikes, and what do you think about Streeting's change in tone?
Well, his change in tone, I think, is him trying to mirror public opinion, insofar as the doctor strikes now have far less support than the original round of doctor strikes did, when Steve Barclay, for example, was just refusing to negotiate with them or even speak to them whilst they were threatening strike action, and then tried to blame them for the strikes when they happened. It's also further away from the pandemic, so I think a lot of salience of the issue of the necessity of these people in society has gone down. Which is sad, of course, but there's always going to be this kind of conflicting relationship with demands for pay from public sector workers and the taxation demands on private sector workers. Like, the government obviously will spend money on public sector wages, and then we'll have to tax some of that back from the private sector to ensure that we don't have an inflationary effect. It has to get taxed back to ensure that there's not too much demand in the economy that might be inflationary. That's the role of taxation from the private sector when you are spending money and you are potentially spending more money on the public sector. So that's the reality, is there is a conflicting relationship there. So you can imagine people in the private sector going, well, not only do I have a public service that I want to be able to be fulfilled by people who are working there, that also might see an increase in my taxes to be able to pay for that. And that would even happen if you didn't have any capital ownership and everyone was just getting paid through, cooperative ownership, for example. So this kind of conflict will always be there, regardless of the way you structure your economy. What's important to understand, though, is that this only makes sense, this argument from the private sector people only really has salience if they had like lower pay than the doctors or public sector workers has, when in reality, the opposite is true. Real terms pay in the private sector, whilst it's not particularly high, it's not risen very much, between 1 and 2 percentage points since 2010, right? They're not exactly living in the lap of luxury, far from it. We're in a cost of living crisis. But the public sector workers have a lower. Their real terms pay has gone down. So whilst the private sector may feel scorned in terms of potential tax increases to be able to raise pay for public sector workers who they feel are holding the government to ransom, in reality, they've been on the receiving end of good policy rather than bad policy when it comes to public sector pay being way lower than what they've been increasing in the private sector. And the reason we've got into this position is because the kind of conservative ideology that has managed the way in which we deal with public sector pay in this country doesn't recognize their value. Now, there's a thing called Baumol's cost disease, which essentially says that public sector workers, especially ones with the low productivity gains, only really get paid in comparison to wage gains in the private sector. So that's even more a reason under conservative ideology to say, well, look, these people are only being paid because of other people, because they believe that taxation funds public spending. When in reality, the whole point of having teachers, doctors, nurses, firefighters, whatever it might be, is that these public sector roles are there to facilitate growth in the private sector. You can't have a growing private sector if you have sick workers, if you have uneducated workers. So the reality is without understanding the value that these public services provide, which conservative ideology just doesn't do because they only view things in terms of raw economic numbers rather than viewing the economy holistically, of course you're going to do what the Tories did for so long, which was impose private sector pay raises and try and justify austerity to please their voter base in the private sector. So I understand why the Labour government feels reticent to want to go against public opinion here, but the public opinion has been primed by essentially, 46 years at the very least 14 years of pretty vociferous public propaganda against the idea of public sector pay awards, or indeed against the idea of raised taxation. So the Labour government are, in my mind, again, in pragmatic terms, all they're going to do is chase these workers away to other countries where we are actually competing. For all these people who talk about market forces wanting to set pay, like we are competing with other nations for paying doctors. And if we don't pay them enough, they'll leave. It's funny how, again, you don't see this argument for doctors, but you hear it all the time for millionaires in terms of taxation. So the government just needs to be honest with the population and say, look, you have had pay rises, small ones, but you have had them since 2010. Public sector workers have seen very, very little. So we're going to have to try and pay them from somewhere. And Wes Streeting's plan of, again, following public opinion rather than a pragmatic policy, or indeed what is morally justified, which is having our public sector workers paid what their labour demands, or what their labour is worth, or indeed what their role in society is worth, is a real misstep.
What you described there is such a good summation of what is so disappointing about this government, which is that it sort of bends itself to public opinion, which is not a kind of organic opinion formed by the public, but one that's very much primed by, as you said, many, many years of Tory government and austerity, but also by a right-wing media sphere, which just constantly pumps out the same sort of analysis, the same kind of analysis, which leads people to be furious at the public sector or to the idea of public sector pay or a bloated public sector. And, in some ways, maybe there are some parts of the public sector that are inefficient, that could be made more efficient. But the point that you make about looking at the economic ecosystem as a whole, as seeing it not just as like the money going into health is through like the salaries, and they can't possibly be higher than they are because then they're getting too big a pay rise, but rather seeing it as, those public sector workers in health, for example, doctors, nurses, they are part of a kind of machine where if they go, it falls apart somewhere else. And the cost of the machine falling apart is so much greater than the cost of oiling the parts that need a bit of oil because they haven't had any for quite a long time. There's a kind of extended mixed metaphor for you. Before we move on, I just want to point out a piece of excellent analysis, I thought, by Novara's Labour correspondent Polly Smythe, which was also in The Guardian. In it, she explains that while those divide and rule tactics that Wes Streeting used might have won out against the doctors this time, the Health Secretary is likely to face a wave of NHS strikes going forward. So do take a look at that if you can. Earlier this week, we brought you Zara Sultana's first interview since she quit the Labour Party earlier this month. And now Jeremy Corbyn has done his first sit-down interview since he and Sultana launched a new left party last week. In a nearly 40-minute chat with Owen Jones, Corbyn covered his time as Labour leader, his thoughts on working with the Greens, and the general state of the world. Owen also asked him how he rated Keir Starmer.
Is this Labour government worse than you would have expected?
Yes, much worse than I expected. I didn't have high expectations of it. The manifesto was insipid, weak, unmemorable. I ask anybody what was in the manifesto, they go, no, they can very seldom name anything that possibly they'll remember breakfast clubs.
Oh, yeah.
Possibly, that's about it. I'm not saying breakfast clubs aren't valuable, they are, but they're not the only thing. So what they've done is what? Minor reforms in terms of rights of renters, slightly greater protection, but no rent control. Some improvement in workers' rights, but no sectoral bargaining, and so on, all the way through. And then rolling back against the environmental agenda, actively pursuing an increase in arms expenditure rather than promoting peace. I'm not pretending the world's simple or easy out there, but if you have an agenda to go to war, as Starmer and Healey appear to do, then what do? You spend more and more money on weapons. And Liz Kendall gets up in Parliament saying she wants to take $5 billion out of the DWP budget, which is earmarked for personal independence payments, and Starmer wants to put $13 billion more into the arms budget. What are we about as a country? Are we going to starve and impoverish people with disabilities in order to buy more planes from the USA? Because that's what it looks like.
Of course, yeah, he's quite right. If you buy all those weapons, you've got to use them. Otherwise, you haven't got any more to buy. You've got to keep it going. Very dangerous economic refooting. Now, the big news is obviously that new party, the new Left Party, of course, it's gained over 600,000 people so far who've all signed up at yourparty.uk. Here's Corbyn on that level of support.
The issue then was forming a new party. We discussed it for quite a while, ideas, structures and so on. And eventually we announced what is a week ago today. And as of this moment, which is 1 hour and 18 minutes short of when we announced, it's now just past 600,000 people registered.
Do you think that surpassed what you expected?
Oh, way above. Yeah, way above. I was thinking 200,000 to begin with, possibly. But this is now larger than the largest Labour Party membership ever, which was 600,000 when I stepped down.
We don't know how low the Labour membership's fallen to either, do they? Because they were figures.
So that's a secret. That's a secret. Even the Communist Party, the Soviet Union, used to publish membership figures.
Even the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was more honest about its membership figures than Keir Starmer's Labour Party. What about the name of that party then? Well, Jeremy told Owen pretty much what Zara told us.
Just explain why your party? Why use that as the beginning?
Me and a few friends have been discussing various names. We tried various things about Party of Peace, Party of Justice, People's Party, which you suggested, and a lot of other names. And I said, look, let's just have a holding name. And let's call it yourparty.uk. And then when we have our founding conference, which will be later this year, guessing November time, we'll decide on a name. It may even be that name. But you know what? The idea you join a party without a name in order to choose the name is not a bad thing. It's democracy in action. And people are going to come up with some mad, zany names. We could end up with sort of Boaty McParty or something, but
sign me up for that.
You'd like that, would you?
I think why not? I mean, let's just, it's a little bit 2018 probably. Labour originally was the Labour Representation Committee for several years before it became the Labour
Well,
Party.
the other idea I had was that we'd call it the Interim Committee for the Development of a meaningful understanding of social change and the need for justice and inequality in a peaceful and sustainable world. So that'll fill up the whole ballot paper, wouldn't it? When you're ready, you think that'll catch up?
I think so. You wouldn't be able to miss it.
It's great to see Jeremy looking so sort of relaxed and energized and full of fun. I have to say, when I interviewed Zara, she was very much the same, very relaxed, energized, good mood. They both seem, freed. Helena, what did you make of the interview? Have you managed to watch all of it? Or if you haven't, what do you make of those clips?
I did watch the interview, and you know what? The change in demeanour is, honestly, it really is night and day. When you see Jeremy and Zara beforehand and seeing them now, the freedom of being out of the clutches of the Labour Party, it makes them just seem so much more relaxed, which is a pretty good evidence of the fact that the Labour Party, at least the dregs of what's left, is essentially just a nest of vipers at this point. People obsessed with their own, like fighting their own shadows and wanting to have this kind of control freak nature within the party, which, from what I continually hear from ex-Labour members, was one of the worst things about Labour Party culture. What I think Owen Jones described these people as soulless and dead behind the eyes. What a young Labour person described the kind of people who would want to get into that position is genuinely said they like the idea of politics. They just want to have the briefcase and the suit and become a politician rather than actually care about, the goals of wanting to change the country. Being out of that kind of sphere must be a huge relief. I was speaking to a Green candidate before the election, the candidate, ironically, for Leicester South, which was the one that Jonathan Ashworth lost to Shokar Adam, Shahman Rahman. And she was pointing out specifically that, you know what, the best thing I did was leave Labour because as soon as I joined the Green Party, which is in her case, and she said, well, the best thing was just being free from the control freaks and being in a party that seemed to actually want me to be there and being part of that and building something new. That must be an incredibly freeing position for Jeremy and Zara to be in. And again, that's something that is built from the ground up as well is so important. This kind of radical internal party democracy, there's going to be a really good thing to see. And even from the basis of choosing the name, I think is a really great idea, is it ensures that there is going to be some buy-in for everybody. Now, what this will mean is it'll end up making something like, make you sound like you're going to move on to a collective farm or something, which, I'm sure they'll want to do that. So at some point, it's up to the members. But at the very least, there'll be enough buy-in. I've already said on Twitter what I think the name should be. I think it should be something that suggests a goal. It sells people on what you want to do, right? By something along the lines of, or related to, we want to solve the cost of living crisis, or we're populist, we're the people versus the elite. Something that rings true for that we are the 99%, rather than it being a gesture towards an ideology. Because you want people broadly across the country, they don't really have a political ideology. And when they think of the left, they think of social progressivism rather than left-wing economics, which have been kind of divorced from that in the kind of post-Blair neoliberal era. So people just want to hear about how you're going to solve their concerns. So something that essentially says, we're on your side, we're against the elites, we are going to deal with the affordability and cost of living crises. That's the kind of name that I would want to go with if I was building a new party from the ground up at time of recording. But honestly, it was just nice to see Jeremy not be within the clutches of a Labour Party that, quite frankly, I think we all realised that he had spent too much time clinging on to. And he still had friends within the party. He mentioned in the interview, he was speaking to people saying that they think it was bad that he was expelled in the way that he was, even who were pretty high up in the party. And I'm just, well, the leadership clearly were treating you like crap. And so you just have to realise that you're better out than in. And this attachment to the name of a party which does not represent or even seem recognisable from its initial foundings mean that something new is necessary. And I'm glad that he's seen the light.
Yeah, me too. And I'm sure this is the same for other people as well. But when I see Jeremy and Zara looking relaxed and joyful and optimistic, it makes me feel relaxed and joyful and optimistic. And I sort of feel that, that's something that's so deeply missing from our politics at the moment. I mean, everything is dark. Reform is dark. Labour is dark. Everything is sort of oppressive and, has a kind of sense of threat to all of it. Whereas, and I'm talking about all I mean, not the Greens, I'll give them that, and also not the Lib Dems, but the others, not the SNP obviously, but, the Tories, Labour, Reform, this sense of, it's a shadow. Whereas, when I see Jeremy and Zara looking happy, it makes me feel happy, and it makes me feel happy about the possibilities of politics. Although I should say that Zara wasn't just all sunshine and light. She was also very ready to scrap. She was very ready to clap back when it comes to attackers, and I liked that too. Now, there was a story in the Telegraph today that just made me laugh and laugh. Apparently, no one called a single baby born in 2024 Keir. The article goes on to say this. For the first time on record, no parent decided to name their newborn after the Labour leader last year, coinciding with Sir Keir Starmer's election as Prime Minister. On Thursday morning, the Office for National Statistics, the ONS, released its annual baby name data, revealing the most popular names for boys and girls in England and Wales. 4 baby Keirs were born in 2023, but none were given the name last year. Now, obviously, Keir hasn't been a particularly popular name for a while, though it is more popular in Scotland. Someone online pointed out to me that there were 7 Keirs in Scotland in 2024. So we shouldn't really draw a causal connection between the extinction of Keir as a name and the beleaguered, very much self-imposed, Prime Minister. But Helena, it is fun to speculate, isn't it?
Well, I mean, what's the first thing that you usually think of when naming your kid, right? Is what would I call them to make sure that they don't get bullied at school? And I'm sure there are plenty of people who would think about calling their child Keir. I've met loads of Keirs, and they essentially all tell me, well, I was named after Keir Hardie, right? That's a long time tradition of naming your children after people that you respect or wanting to carry on some kind of the legacy of what Keir Hardie represented, which has obviously been outshined by Keir Starmer, who was named within that same realm. But even if you were going to potentially name your kid Keir because of that, and as we've seen, it's at least some people decide to, even if it's only a small amount over the past however long, because it's not a particularly popular name, it's not a particularly modern name nowadays. Anyway, that even those few who might potentially do so in 2025, they will immediately take 1 second to go, maybe not the name of the Prime Minister. Even if you liked Keir Starmer, even if you didn't think that naming yourself close to the Prime Minister of this country was somehow a damning indictment because of how much of a monster that he is, then you might at least go, well, if my kid goes to school and Keir Starmer's still the Prime Minister, they're going to get bullied for having the same name as the Prime Minister, aren't they? Regardless of whether their opinions of Keir Starmer are as sour as they are right now. Well, let's be real. Like, this guy's approval rating is like minus 40%. He's not liked. He is pretty hated. So I'm not going to try and say that I think that there's no connection between his public perception and the idea that people would be kind of put off by the name Keir, because what's he synonymous with? Being a liar. It's synonymous with, some people's names, two-tier Keir, for example. Like, both the left and the right really dislike him. He represents a really small category of a kind of Mondeo men voters, you know? So I think that I'm willing to at least entertain the idea that there is a potential that the antipathy towards Keir Starmer at least has some bearing on the fact that people are pretty unwilling to put their name to that children.
Keir today, gone tomorrow. Bada boom. Thank you, Helena, for joining me tonight.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Stephen. Looking forward to next time.
And thanks everyone for tuning in. Please come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.